A crisis can come to any one of us at any time. We're not expecting it. It can be a knock on the door, a telephone call, a text, an email. And suddenly, when everything was going okay, we're plunged into what we call a crisis. We weren't expecting it, we haven't contributed to it, it's circumstances beyond our control, but nevertheless we find ourselves in a situation that we call a crisis. And that's where Nehemiah was in chapter 1. Everything was fine, he was in a good place himself, and he inquired of some people who were travelling, how's things in Jerusalem? And the news that he received was that the walls were rubble in verse 3 and the gates are cinders. So that threw him into a crisis. It can be a different sort of crisis that we find ourselves in, but nevertheless that's where we are because of some unexpected news. When I think of the European Union, I have mixed feelings on that, and I'm not particularly pro, but one of the things that I've always believed is that it brings security, it brings safety, it brings stability. For example, I've always believed we'll never have another European war because of the interaction of the countries in the European Union. I've always believed we've got economic stability, that no matter what happens in the rest of the world, we'll be okay because the strength in numbers. But what we've seen in recent months is that that is not the case. In fact, as I speak now, you've got situations in Spain and Greece where those countries are literally bankrupt and are being held up and sustained by some of the other nations getting involved and helping them out. So what we see as a security, a safety, a stability suddenly is taken away from us, and that can be another crisis that we find ourselves in. And incidentally, I read a report the other day that by the year 2020 that the USA could be the next Greece. So whether it's on a national level or even an international level, or probably more to the point on a personal level, something happens that plunges us into a crisis. Now, a crisis automatically produces a challenge. A crisis equals challenge. We can't ignore it. It's like our bodies. We find a lump or we find something that's not right with our bodies. So the first thing we do is we go to the GP. I've been there myself a couple of times, and on both occasions I'm happy to say that it wasn't anything serious. But if you find a lump or you find something, a cancer related type of possible situation, you have to go to the GP. That's the first port of call, and then he refers you to the specialist, the hospital, and they do all the stuff there. But we can't ignore it, because people that ignore things often end up dying because they pretended that it wasn't there. If there's a crisis, it's a challenge. We can't ignore that. The two go hand in hand. Whatever we find ourselves plunged into, whether it's a health situation, whether it's a relationship situation, whether it's the job or work or money, whatever it might be, we have to face up to that. It's a challenge. You hear stories of people that lose their jobs or lose their overtime or something like that, and they can't pay the mortgage anymore, and they ignore it and they let it go and go and go. And the building societies then are forced to take action because the mortgage hasn't been paid and no one's made contact. And they're forever saying, if you have any problems, you lose your job, financial difficulties, get in touch right at the start, and then we can perhaps do something about it. So on whatever level it is, a crisis equals a challenge. And in terms of a crisis, in terms of the challenge that it produces, there are two responses really from us. We will either crumble or we will conquer, and which one is determined by how we view it, how we tackle it. Do we ignore it? If we ignore it, we'll crumble. If we don't go to the GPs, if we ignore the financial situation, if we try to, as we say, brush those things under the carpet, then we will automatically crumble. The only way to confront a crisis, the challenge of a crisis, is actually to have that mentality that we will conquer it. And I know people that have been diagnosed with pretty serious illnesses, and they've gone to the specialist, they've gone through the system, and their attitude has been very much, whatever you want me to do, I will do this. I have to stop this, I will stop it. I have to do this, I will start doing that. Whatever it takes, I'm prepared to listen to your advice. On the other hand, I also have known people that have got illnesses, and their attitude has been, well, I'll still do my own thing, and I'll still carry on, and I'll live how I want to. And I do know people that have died as a result of that type of an attitude. The reality is, if we take an attitude of crumbling, we will crumble. If we take an attitude of conquering, it doesn't mean to say that we will necessarily conquer, but at least we've got a chance. And depending on the situation, whether it's health, relationship, finances, or whatever, the only alternative, if we want to break that crisis, if we want to come through that crisis, the challenge that the crisis brings, is to take an attitude that we will conquer it. And to do that, it takes commitment. It doesn't just happen. With Nehemiah, we read in verse 4 that he sat down, he wept, and he mourned for days, fasting and praying. Remember, Nehemiah's situation was a very spiritual one, so that was his response. Certainly we involve God in the equation, but there may be other practical things that we can do in terms of the crisis that we are confronted with. Now, back in 2002, not so much a crisis, of course, but I stepped on the scales on January the 1st, and I was shocked to see, I hadn't been on the scales for a while, to see just how much weight I'd put on. Very gradual, and the odd pound here and there, but of course it soon mounts up. So I made a commitment, because that's what we need to conquer a crisis, a commitment to shed some weight. And since then, over a period of time, I've moved 5 weight brackets down, and I'm at the weight now where I want to be for the rest of my life. Now, it's not been easy. To move those 5 weight brackets down has taken commitment and dedication. It's been a battle at times, because I'm definitely a chocoholic, ice cream monster, crisp fanatic, all of those things. I love them. So the battles that I've had with Mr. Walker and Mr. Cadbury and Mr. Ben and Jerry have been battles at times. It's not easy. You don't just say to yourself, I think I'll lose some weight, and then a couple of weeks later everyone's commenting, you've lost 3 stone, you've lost 4 stone. It doesn't work like that. It takes commitment. And whatever crisis, mine wasn't a crisis with the weight, of course, it was just a decision. But whatever crisis we find ourselves in, finance, relationship, work, or whatever, it will take commitment to bring it down. And that's the only way we will conquer that crisis, bring the crisis to its knees, defeat it, and have the victory. So a crisis equals automatically a challenge. We're faced with the challenge of a crisis. What do? 2 things really. 2 options available to us. We can either crumble or we can conquer. And if we are to conquer, then the only way we will do that is through commitment, dedication, and hard work.